Have you ever wondered what it feels like to watch your entire family live their best lives while you're stuck changing bedpans and crushing pills at 3 in the morning? My name is Eunice Chen, and from wherever you're watching this, I need you to understand something that took me 32 years to figure out. Sometimes the people who call you family are really just using you as their get-out-of-responsibility-free card. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning everything changed started like every other morning, for the past 4 years. I woke up at 5:30 to the sound of Dad coughing in the next room, that wet, rattling sound that meant his lungs were filling up again. The hospice nurse wouldn't arrive until 8, which gave me 2.5 hours to handle his morning medications, help him to the bathroom, change his sheets if needed, and somehow make myself presentable for another day of pretending I had a life outside these 4 walls. Dad had been diagnosed with emphysema and congestive heart failure when I was 28. The doctors gave him 2 years, maybe 3 if he was lucky. That was 4 years ago. 4 years of watching the strongest man I'd ever known shrink into, someone who needed help buttoning his shirts. 4 years of learning medical terminology I never wanted to know, of becoming an expert on oxygen concentrators and pill schedules, and the exact angle to prop pillows so he could breathe easier at night. But here's what really gets me. While I was learning how to use a blood pressure cuff and memorizing the side effects of 12 different medications, my brother Marcus was backpacking through Europe, posting Instagram stories from Prague and Barcelona and Amsterdam, #tagged blessed, #living my best life, #grateful. Jessica, my younger sister, was throwing parties at her downtown loft, dating different guys every month, and building what she called her influencer brand by reviewing trendy restaurants and boutique hotels. Neither of them ever asked how I was holding up. Neither of them ever offered to take a shift, not even for a weekend. When I'd mention on our rare family calls that Dad had been having a rough week, Marcus would say something like, "That's so hard, Eunice. You're amazing for handling all that," and then immediately change the subject to his latest adventure. Jessica would make sympathetic noises and promise to visit soon, but soon never came. Mom, Linda, lived in denial like it was a vacation home she never wanted to leave. She'd visit Dad twice a week, bringing flowers and staying for exactly 45 minutes. Long enough to feel like she'd done her duty, short enough that she never had to deal with anything messy. She'd always leave before it was time for his evening medications, claiming she had book club or yoga class or dinner plans with friends. Always something more important than staying to help the daughter who'd put her entire life on hold. The Lagarfias house on Maple Street had become my prison, though I'd never said that out loud until now. It was a beautiful Victorian that Dad had restored himself in the 70s, with original hardwood floors and stained glass windows that caught the morning light just right. But beauty doesn't matter much when you're scrubbing vomit out of century-old floorboards at 2 in the morning because someone's new medication isn't sitting well. I'd quit my job at the marketing firm 3 months after Dad's diagnosis. At first, I thought it would be temporary, just until we got his care routine figured out. But as his condition worsened, temporary became permanent. I couldn't leave him alone for 8 hours a day, not when he might fall trying to get to the bathroom, or forget to take his heart medication, or have one of those panic attacks that made his breathing even worse. My savings disappeared first, eaten up by medical bills that insurance wouldn't cover and modifications to make the house more accessible. Then my social life evaporated, because who wants to hang out with someone who can't leave the house after 6 p.m. and always smells faintly of disinfectant? My relationship with David, a guy I'd been seeing for 2 years, ended when he got tired of canceled dates and interrupted phone calls. He said he understood, but understanding and actually living with the reality are 2 different things. The loneliness was the hardest part. Not just being alone, but feeling invisible even when people were around. When Marcus did call, he'd talk for 20 minutes about his job at the tech startup, his new girlfriend, the half marathon he was training for. If he asked about Dad, it was always in that careful, distant way that let me know he didn't really want details. Jessica was worse because she'd visit occasionally, sweeping in with expensive coffee and designer handbags, staying just long enough to take a selfie with Dad that she'd post later with some caption about family being everything. But they never saw him at 3 a.m. when the fluid in his lungs made every breath sound like drowning. They never had to hold his hand during panic attacks, or clean up accidents when his medications gave him diarrhea, or sit with him in the ER, waiting room for 6 hours because he was having chest pains that turned out to be anxiety, but might have been another heart attack. They got to see Grandpa Bob, the charming storyteller with twinkling eyes. I got to see Robert Chen, the dying man who was scared and angry and sometimes mean because being sick is terrifying and there's nowhere for that fear to go except onto the person closest to you. Don't get me wrong. I loved my father more than anything in this world. He'd been my hero growing up, the parent who taught me to ride a bike and helped with homework and told me I could be anything I wanted to be. But love and resentment can exist in the same space, and I resented the hell out of being the only one who showed up. I resented Marcus for sending money instead of time, as if throwing cash at the situation absolved him of actually being present. I resented Jessica for her performative visits and her social media posts that made it look like she was deeply involved in Dad's care. Most of all, I resented Mom for acting like Dad's illness was something that was happening to her, rather than something we all needed to deal with together as a family. The morning of the will reading, I'd been up since 4 because Dad was having one of his bad nights. His oxygen levels kept dropping, and he was restless and confused, calling out for his mother who'd been dead for 20 years. By sunrise, he'd finally settled into a fitful sleep, and I sat in the kitchen with my 3rd cup of coffee, staring at legal documents I didn't understand, and wondering how I was going to pay for the home health aid we desperately needed. Dad had passed 2 weeks earlier, on a Tuesday morning while I was helping him with breakfast. He'd been eating oatmeal, complaining that it was too sweet, when he suddenly stopped mid-sentence and looked at me with this expression of complete surprise. Then he was gone. Just like that. No dramatic final words, no peaceful closing of eyes. One moment he was there, annoyed about breakfast, and the next moment he wasn't. The funeral had been exactly what you'd expect. Marcus flew in from Seattle, took a week off work, and gave a beautiful eulogy about Dad's strength and wisdom and the lessons he'd taught us about perseverance. Jessica spoke about childhood memories and Dad's sense of humor, how he used to make pancakes shaped like animals on Sunday mornings. Mom cried elegantly, the kind of restrained weeping that looks dignified in photographs. I didn't speak at the funeral. I was too tired, too numb, too angry at all of them for showing up to grieve a man they'd barely visited in his final years. People kept coming up to me saying things like, "Your father was so lucky to have you," and "You're such a devoted daughter," as if my devotion had been a choice, rather than the default position I'd fallen into because everyone else had better things to do. The law office of Thompson and Associates smelled like leather and old paper, the kind of place that charges by the hour just for sitting in their chairs. Marcus arrived in his Tesla, checking his phone constantly because he had an important meeting that afternoon and couldn't stay long. Jessica was 20 minutes late, apologizing profusely while scrolling through her Instagram notifications. Mom sat perfectly composed in her black dress, the same one she'd worn to Dad's funeral, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue even though she wasn't actually crying. Mr. Thompson was ancient, probably Dad's age, with liver spots on his hands, and a voice that shook slightly when he read. He'd known our family for decades, had handled Dad's business affairs and estate planning since before I was born. He looked at me with something that might have been pity as he spread the documents across his mahogany desk. "The will was straightforward," he said. Dad had been very specific about his wishes. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The house would go to Mom, along with his life insurance policy and retirement accounts. Marcus would inherit Dad's tools and workshop equipment, plus a substantial cash settlement. Jessica would receive Dad's car, some family jewelry, and another cash settlement. There were smaller bequests to various charities and longtime friends. I sat there waiting for my name, feeling increasingly cold as Mr. Thompson continued reading. Maybe I'd get some of Dad's books, or his collection of vintage postcards, or the rocking chair where I'd spent so many nights helping him through insomnia and panic attacks. Something to acknowledge the 4 years I'd given up, the life I'd put on hold, the sacrifices I'd made without being asked. But my name never came. Not once. Not for anything. The silence in the room was deafening when Mr. Thompson finished reading. Marcus cleared his throat and asked if there might be another document, maybe something that had been overlooked. Jessica looked genuinely confused, asking if Dad had maybe written me a separate letter. Mom just stared at her hands, twisting her wedding ring around and around her finger. Mr. Thompson shook his head slowly. He'd asked Dad specifically about provisions for me, he said, given everything I'd done. Dad's response had been that I was young and capable, that I'd figure things out. He hadn't wanted to burden me with property taxes and maintenance on a house that would be too big for one person. The money was better invested in Marcus's business and Jessica's future, since they had more expenses and responsibilities. I felt something crack inside my chest, like ice breaking on a frozen lake. 4 years of my life. 4 years of medications and doctor's appointments and sleepless nights and canceled plans and lost opportunities. 4 years of being the responsible one, the reliable one, the one who could be counted on to handle everything so everyone else could live their lives freely. And Dad's final message to me was that I was young and capable enough to figure it out on my own. Marcus started to say something about how unfair this was, how Dad must have been confused or influenced by his medications. Jessica was crying, real tears this time, saying she didn't want the money if it meant I got nothing. Mom finally looked up and said quietly that Dad had always been proud of my independence, that he probably thought he was giving me the gift of freedom by not tying me down with property and obligations. But I knew better. This wasn't about freedom or independence or Dad's confidence in my abilities. This was about the same pattern that had defined our family for as long as I could remember. I was the one who handled things. I was the one who could be counted on. I was the one who didn't need taking care of because I was too busy taking care of everyone else. In Dad's mind, and apparently in everyone else's, my reward for being selfless was supposed to be the opportunity to continue being selfless. I stood up slowly, carefully, the way you move when you're afraid you might shatter. I looked at each of them, these people who shared my DNA but had never really shared my burden. Marcus with his expensive watch and his startup stock options, Jessica with her designer handbag and her influencer income, Mom with her book clubs and yoga classes and social calendar that had never had room for helping her husband through his final illness. I need some air, I said, and walked out of that office into the Portland sunshine, leaving them to figure out whatever came next. For the first time in 4 years, that would be someone else's problem. The parking garage was cool and dim, and I sat in my 15-year-old Honda Civic for a long time, not crying, not screaming, just breathing and trying to process what had just happened. My phone buzzed with texts from Marcus and Jessica, both saying they wanted to talk, both insisting this wasn't fair, both promising they'd make it right somehow. But their promises felt as empty as their presence had been during Dad's illness. I drove home to the house on Maple Street, the house that now belonged to Mom, and started packing. I didn't have much to pack, really. 4 years of caregiving hadn't left much room for accumulating possessions. My clothes, my laptop, some books, a few photos. The life I'd built before Dad got sick had been dismantled piece by piece, and what remained could fit in 6 cardboard boxes and 2 suitcases. As I folded clothes and wrapped picture frames in newspaper, I thought about all the times I'd imagined this moment. Not Dad's death, but the moment when I'd finally be free to rebuild my life. I'd always pictured it differently, though. I'd imagined having time to plan, maybe some financial cushion to ease the transition. I'd imagined feeling sad but hopeful, grieving but ready for whatever came next. Instead, I felt hollow, used up, like a tool that had served its purpose and could now be discarded. The anger would come later, but right then, I just felt empty in a way that scared me. My phone rang as I was taping up the last box. It was Mom calling from the law office. "Eunice, honey, we need to talk about this. Your father loved you so much. He was always bragging about how capable you were, how proud he was that you'd stepped up to take care of him. Maybe we can work something out with the house, or Marcus and Jessica could share some of their inheritance." I listened to her voice, the same voice that had made excuses for 4 years about why she couldn't help more, why she couldn't stay longer, why she couldn't take a shift so I could have a break. The same voice that had thanked me for being so responsible, so dependable, so willing to sacrifice my own needs for the family. "Mom," I said quietly, "if Dad was so proud of me, why didn't he leave me anything? Not money, not property, not even a letter acknowledging what I'd given up?" There was a long pause. "He thought he was giving you freedom, honey. He didn't want you to feel trapped by obligations." "I was already trapped by obligations," I said. "For 4 years. While Marcus traveled and Jessica partied and you went to book club, I was trapped in this house watching Dad die by inches. And now that he's gone, my reward is to be set free with nothing to show for those 4 years except medical debt and a gap in my resume." "That's not fair," Mom said, and I could hear her starting to cry. "We all loved your father. We all did what we could. But that was the problem, wasn't it? They'd all done what they could, which was as little as possible while still being able to look at themselves in the mirror. I'd done what I had to do, which was everything." I hung up without saying goodbye and finished loading my car. Then I drove away from the house on Maple Street, away from Portland, away from the family that had taken 4 years of my life and given me nothing in return except the knowledge that love, when it's only flowing in one direction, eventually runs dry. I drove north toward Seattle, toward whatever life I could build from scratch at 32 with no savings, no job, and no safety net, except my own determination to never again be the person everyone could count on to handle everything. While they handled nothing, the interstate stretched ahead of me like a promise, and for the first time in 4 years, I didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But I knew one thing for certain. It would be mine to decide. The motel room in Salem smelled like industrial, disinfectant and old cigarettes, but it was quiet and it was mine for the night. I sat on the scratchy bedspread with takeout Chinese food growing cold beside me, finally allowing myself to think about everything that had led to this moment. The will reading had been the final blow, but the cracks in my family's foundation had been showing for years. I pulled out my phone and scrolled back through old photos, looking for evidence of the pattern I was only now beginning to see clearly. There it was, Christmas 3 years ago. Dad was already on oxygen by then, the clear plastic tubes snaking around his ears making him look fragile in a way that still shocked me. In the photo, Marcus and Jessica were laughing at something, champagne glasses in their hands, while I stood slightly apart, holding Dad's nebulizer and checking my watch because it was almost time for his evening medications. Jessica had flown in from Los Angeles that Christmas, where she'd been trying to make it as an influencer. She'd brought presents wrapped in expensive paper and talked endlessly about brand partnerships and sponsored content and follower engagement rates. She'd also brought her new boyfriend, a wannabe actor who kept checking his reflection in every available surface and calling everyone bro in a way that made Dad wince. Marcus had driven down from Seattle with his girlfriend Claire, a software engineer who spoke in corporate buzzwords and treated family dinner like a networking event. They'd given Dad a fancy digital picture frame loaded with photos from their European vacation, as if what he really needed was a constant reminder of all the places he'd never get to visit again. I'd spent that entire Christmas day managing Dad's care routine while everyone else got drunk on Mom's expensive wine. When Dad had an anxiety attack after dinner, triggered by too much noise and stimulation, I was the one who sat with him in his bedroom for 2 hours, holding his hand and helping him through breathing exercises while the party continued downstairs. When I finally came back down, Marcus asked if Dad was okay, and when I said he was just overwhelmed, Marcus nodded sympathetically and immediately launched into a story about work stress and how hard it was to find work-life balance in the tech industry. Nobody asked if I needed a break. Nobody offered to take the next shift so I could enjoy some wine and family time. It was just assumed that I would handle it, the same way it was assumed that I would handle everything else. I was the caregiver. That was my role. Everyone else got to be the fun relatives who showed up for holidays and birthdays, while I got to be the one who made sure Dad didn't die alone on a Tuesday afternoon. I found another photo from that Christmas, one Jessica had posted on Instagram. It showed our whole family gathered around Dad's chair, everyone smiling and looking perfect. The caption read, "So grateful for this beautiful family and all the love we share. Nothing matters more than these moments together. Family is everything." The photo had gotten over 300 likes and dozens of comments about how blessed we looked. What the photo didn't show was that it had taken 15 minutes to set up because Dad kept coughing and needed his oxygen turned up. It didn't show that I'd had to clean vomit off his shirt 10 minutes before the photo because his new medication was making him nauseous. It didn't show that Marcus had complained about how long it was taking because he wanted to get back to the football game, or that Jessica had retaken the photo 6 times to make sure her makeup looked perfect. But there we all were, frozen in time, looking like the perfect, loving family. Jessica had built her brand on moments like these, curated glimpses of a life that existed only in carefully staged photographs. The reality was messier, but reality didn't get likes on social media. I kept scrolling back, looking for the moment, when everything changed, when I became the designated caregiver and everyone else became visitors in Dad's life. It hadn't happened all at once. It had been a gradual shift, so subtle that I hadn't even noticed it happening until it was too late to change course. It started with Mom. The day Dad was diagnosed, she'd fallen apart so completely that I'd had to take charge of everything. I was the one who asked the doctor questions, who took notes, who scheduled follow-up appointments. I was the one who researched his conditions online and made lists of dietary changes and exercise modifications. Mom just sat in the corner crying, overwhelmed by the thought of losing the man she'd been married to for 35 years. At first, I thought her reaction was normal. Of course she was devastated. Of course she needed time to process the news. But weeks turned into months, and she never stepped up to take charge of Dad's care. Instead, she seemed to retreat further into denial, treating his illness like a temporary inconvenience that would resolve itself if she just ignored it long enough. When I suggested that we look into home health aides or adult daycare programs, Mom would get upset and say she didn't want strangers in her house taking care of her husband. But she also wouldn't take on the responsibility herself. She'd help with the easy things, bringing Dad his meals or picking up prescriptions, but anything that required real caregiving skills or emotional labor fell to me. Marcus had his own excuses. He lived 4 hours away in Seattle, he said. He had a demanding job and couldn't just drop everything every time Dad had a crisis. He sent money instead, generous checks that helped with medical expenses but didn't address the fundamental problem, which was that Dad needed daily care and supervision that couldn't be bought. I understood the practical limitations of distance, but what hurt was how little effort Marcus made to be involved in other ways. He rarely called Dad directly, preferring to get updates through me. When he did visit, it was always on his schedule, never when Dad was having a particularly hard time and could have used the emotional support. He treated Dad's illness like a problem that could be solved with enough money and proper management, rather than a devastating loss that required presence and patience and love. Jessica was worse because she lived closer, but acted like she lived on another planet. She was only 2 hours away in Portland, pursuing her influencer dreams in an expensive apartment downtown, but she might as well have been on Mars for all the help she provided. She'd visit once a month if we were lucky, always bringing gifts that showed how little she understood what Dad actually needed. One time, she brought him a subscription box of gourmet coffee, not realizing that caffeine made his heart palpitations worse. Another time, she brought a complicated meditation app, as if what he needed was more technology in his life rather than simple human companionship. She meant well, I think, but her gifts always felt more about making herself feel better than actually helping Dad. The worst part was how she'd document these visits on social media, making it seem like she was deeply involved in Dad's care. She'd post photos of herself sitting with him, captions about the importance of family and cherishing every moment. Her followers would comment about what a wonderful daughter she was, how inspiring it was to see her prioritizing family over career. But I knew the truth behind those posts. I knew that she'd usually stay for less than 2 hours, just long enough to take some photos and fulfill whatever emotional obligation she felt. I knew that she'd leave before it was time for Dad's difficult medications, the ones that made him nauseated and cranky. I knew that she'd never seen him during one of his panic attacks, never had to clean up after an accident, never had to sit with him at 3 in the morning when he couldn't sleep because he was afraid he wouldn't wake up. The pattern became so established that it felt inevitable. I was the one who understood Dad's medications and medical equipment. I was the one who knew how to calm him down during anxiety attacks. I was the one who had reorganized my entire life around his needs. It just made sense that I would continue to be the primary caregiver, even as the demands increased and my own life disappeared entirely. But looking back now, I could see how they'd all participated in creating this dynamic. Every time Mom said she was too overwhelmed to handle Dad's medical appointments, every time Marcus sent money instead of time, every time Jessica posted a touching social media tribute instead of actually showing up to help, they were reinforcing the idea that caregiving was my job and my job alone. They'd turned me into the family's designated caregiver, and then they'd convinced themselves that I was naturally suited for the role. I was organized, they said. I was good with medical stuff. I was patient and nurturing. I didn't mind sacrifice, the way other people did. These weren't compliments, I realized now. They were justifications for their own absence. The truth was, I had minded the sacrifice. I'd minded it desperately. I'd minded giving up my job and my social life and my relationship. With David, I'd minded spending my savings on medical equipment and home modifications. I'd minded being constantly exhausted and stressed and worried about Dad's condition. But I'd also learned not to express these feelings because whenever I did, I was made to feel selfish and ungrateful. If I mentioned that I was tired, Mom would remind me that she was grieving too, and this was hard on everyone. If I asked Marcus or Jessica to help more, they'd point out all the ways they were already contributing. Money from Marcus. Social media promotion of Dad's condition to raise awareness, from Jessica. Emotional support for Mom, from both of them. I was just being asked to handle the day-to-day stuff, they said, as if day-to-day caregiving was somehow less important than these other forms of support. I'd internalized their narrative so completely that I'd started to believe it myself. I was good at caregiving. I was naturally suited for it. I didn't need the same kind of acknowledgement and support that other people needed because I was stronger, more capable, more selfless. It wasn't until I was sitting in that motel room, completely alone and financially ruined, that I realized how thoroughly I'd been manipulated. They hadn't just failed to help with Dad's care, they'd actively constructed a family mythology that justified their absence and my presence. In their version of the story, I was the hero, The devoted daughter who sacrificed everything for love. It was a beautiful story, and it served everyone's interests except mine. Because heroes don't get rewarded in real life the way they do in movies. Heroes just get more opportunities to be heroic, more people to save, more sacrifices to make. And when the story ends, when the person they've been saving dies anyway, heroes are expected to be grateful for the experience and move on quietly to the next crisis. I pulled out a notepad and started making a list of everything I'd given up for Dad's care. My job at Morrison Marketing, where I'd been on track for a promotion to senior account manager, my relationship with David, who'd proposed 6 months before Dad's diagnosis and had been talking about starting a family, my graduate school plans. I'd been accepted to a master's program in nonprofit management at Portland State, with classes. That would have started just 2 months after Dad's diagnosis. My social circle had evaporated gradually. Friends stopped inviting me to things because I always had to cancel at the last minute. The few who stayed in touch eventually got tired of conversations that always centered around medical updates and caregiving challenges. I didn't blame them, exactly. Nobody wants to be around someone who's constantly stressed and exhausted and has nothing to talk about except illness and death. But I also wrote down the things I'd gained, the skills, and knowledge that nobody else in my family had bothered to develop. I knew how to operate a nebulizer and check blood pressure and monitor oxygen levels. I knew the side effects of a dozen different medications and which ones couldn't be taken together. I knew how to transfer someone safely from a bed to a wheelchair and how to make a hospital bed comfortable for someone with breathing problems. I knew how to navigate insurance companies and Medicare bureaucracy. I knew how to communicate with doctors and nurses and social workers. I knew how to research medical conditions and treatment options and clinical trials. I knew how to manage a complex care routine and coordinate multiple healthcare providers and keep detailed medical records. Most importantly, I knew how to stay calm in a crisis. I knew how to make quick decisions under pressure. I knew how to comfort someone who was scared and in pain. I knew how to be present with someone who was dying, really present, without trying to fix anything or make it better, or pretend it wasn't happening. These weren't skills you learned in college or picked up at a corporate job. These were skills you developed by showing up, day after day, for someone who needed you. They were valuable skills, even if my family had never acknowledged their value. Even if the will reading had made it clear that Dad hadn't considered them worth compensating. I thought about all the times over the past 4 years when I'd felt invisible, even when I was working the hardest. When Dad would thank the visiting nurse profusely for checking his blood pressure, something I did twice a day without any acknowledgement. When relatives would praise Mom for being so strong and supportive, even though her support consisted mainly of bringing Dad newspapers he was too tired to read. When Marcus would get credit for being the successful son who took care of the family, financially, even though my unpaid labor was worth far more than his monthly checks. The visiting nurse had actually commented on this once, a woman named Carol who came twice a week to check Dad's vitals and assess his condition. She'd been working in home health care for 20 years, she said, and she'd never seen a family member as competent and dedicated as me. Most adult children couldn't handle the level of care I was providing, she said. Most families had to hire professional caregivers or move their loved one to a facility. But when she'd suggested to Dad that he was lucky to have such a devoted daughter, Dad had brushed off the compliment. "Oh, Eunice has always been responsible," he'd said. "She's good at this kind of thing." As if caregiving was just another household chore, like doing laundry or washing dishes, rather than a complex and emotionally demanding job that was consuming my entire life. Carol had looked at me with something like pity after that interaction. Later, when Dad was napping, she'd pulled me aside and said that I should make sure I was taking care of myself too. Caregiver burnout was real, she said. It was important to have support and to take breaks and to remember that I couldn't pour from an empty cup. I'd nodded and thanked her for the advice, but privately I'd wondered what taking care of myself would even look like. I'd been running on autopilot for so long that I'd forgotten I had needs of my own. When Carol suggested that other family members could take shifts so I could have some time off, I'd actually laughed. Marcus and Jessica taking shifts? Mom managing Dad's medical routine? It was such an impossible scenario that I couldn't even imagine it. But now, sitting in this motel room with my entire life packed into cardboard boxes, I wished I'd listened to Carol's advice. I wished I'd insisted on help, even if it made me seem selfish or demanding. I wished I'd protected my own interests instead of assuming that my sacrifice would eventually be recognized and rewarded. The truth was, I'd been complicit in my own exploitation. I'd accepted the role of family caregiver because it had felt noble and important, because taking care of Dad had been an act of love. But I'd also accepted it because I'd been afraid of being seen as selfish or uncaring if I asked for help. I'd been so invested in being the good daughter that I'd forgotten to be a whole person. My phone buzzed with another text from Jessica. "Eunice, please call me back. This isn't right and we need to figure out how to fix it. Marcus and I have been talking and we want to share our inheritance with you. Family sticks together." I stared at the message for a long time before deleting. Family sticks together. Where had that philosophy been for the past 4 years? Where had it been when I was drowning in medical bills and isolation and exhaustion? Where had it been when I was watching my entire life disappear while they pursued their dreams and built their careers and traveled the world? They wanted to fix it now, but only because the will reading had made the inequality impossible to ignore. Only because they were feeling guilty and uncomfortable and maybe a little embarrassed about how things had played out. But their guilt didn't change the fact that they'd been perfectly content to let me sacrifice everything while they sacrificed nothing. Their offer to share the inheritance felt like another form of charity, another way of positioning me as the recipient of their generosity rather than acknowledging that I'd earned something through my own contributions. They would give me money out of the kindness of their hearts, and I would be expected to be grateful and gracious and to forget about the 4 years of abandoned responsibility that had led to this moment. But I didn't want their charity. I didn't want to be rescued by the same people who had failed to show up when I actually needed them. I wanted something they couldn't give me, which was acknowledgement that what I'd done had mattered, that the sacrifices I'd made had been real and valuable and worthy of recognition. I wanted Dad to have left me something, anything, that showed he understood what I'd given up for him. Not necessarily money or property, but maybe a letter expressing gratitude, or a piece of his woodworking equipment, or even just a mention in the will that acknowledged my role in his care. Some sign that my 4 years of devotion had registered with him as something more than just my natural personality expressing itself. But Dad's will had been as silent about my contributions as my family had been for the past 4 years. I was the capable one, the responsible one, the one who would figure things out. I didn't need recognition or compensation because helping others was just what I did, as natural and unconscious as breathing. I realized now that this narrative had been incredibly convenient for everyone except me. It allowed them to feel good about their own limited contributions while absolving them of any responsibility to do more. It positioned my sacrifice as a choice rather than an expectation, my exhaustion as a minor inconvenience rather than a genuine crisis. Most importantly, it allowed them to avoid confronting the reality of what Dad's illness had cost our family and how unfairly that cost had been distributed. As long as I was the naturally nurturing one who didn't mind sacrifice, they didn't have to examine their own roles or question whether they could have done more. The anger was starting to build now, hot and clean and clarifying. Not just anger at the will reading, but anger at 4 years of invisibility and assumption and casual exploitation. Anger at being taken for granted by people who claim to love me. Anger at myself for accepting it all so passively, for being so desperate, to be seen as good and selfless that I'd forgotten to protect my own interests. I pulled out my laptop and started researching apartments in Seattle. I'd always liked the city during my visits to see Marcus, and it was far enough from Portland that I wouldn't have to worry about running into family members at the grocery store. It was also a place where my skills might be valued, where there were hospitals and healthcare organizations and nonprofit agencies that worked with caregivers and families dealing with chronic illness. I had enough money for a security deposit and first month's rent, barely. After that, I'd need to find work quickly. But for the first time in 4 years, the prospect of looking for a job felt exciting rather than impossible. I could work normal hours. I could take lunch breaks. I could have conversations about something other than medical conditions and insurance claims. I could build a life that belonged entirely to me. As I scrolled through apartment listings, I found myself thinking about Carol, the visiting nurse, who'd tried to warn me about caregiver burnout. She'd mentioned once that she'd gotten into healthcare after caring for her own mother, who'd had Alzheimer's. It had been the hardest thing she'd ever done, she said, but it had also taught her skills and given her a sense of purpose that had shaped her entire career. Maybe there was something there for me, too. Maybe the skills I'd developed over the past 4 years weren't just a consolation prize for the life I'd given up. Maybe they were the foundation for something new, something that would give meaning to all the sacrifice and struggle and heartbreak. I closed the laptop and lay back on the uncomfortable motel bed, listening to the traffic on Interstate 5 and thinking about tomorrow. For the first time since Dad's diagnosis, I didn't know what tomorrow would bring. I didn't have a care routine to manage or medications to organize or appointments to coordinate. It should have felt terrifying, but instead it felt like possibility. 4 years of taking care of someone else had taught me that I was stronger and more capable than I'd ever imagined. Now it was time to find out what I could accomplish when I was taking care of myself. The last thing I did before falling asleep was block Marcus and Jessica's phone numbers, not out of spite, but out of self-preservation. I needed time and space to figure out who I was when I wasn't defined by my willingness to sacrifice everything for people who wouldn't do the same for me. Tomorrow I would drive to Seattle and start building a life that belonged entirely to me. Tonight, for the first time in 4 years, I slept through the night without waking up to check on anyone else. The studio apartment in Capitol Hill was exactly what I needed. Small enough that I could afford it, bright enough that I didn't feel trapped, and anonymous enough that I could start over without anyone knowing my history. The landlord, Mrs. Kim, was a no-nonsense woman in her 60s who asked for first month's rent, security deposit, and proof of employment. When I explained that I was between jobs but had references from healthcare professionals, she looked at me with the shrewd assessment of someone who'd dealt with plenty of tenants in transition. "You take care of sick people?" she asked, and when I nodded, she softened slightly. "My husband, he had diabetes, very hard work, taking care of sick family. You find jobs soon, I think." She was right. Within 2 weeks, I'd landed a position as a patient advocate at Swedish Medical Center, helping families navigate the same insurance maze and medical bureaucracy I'd learned to maneuver during Dad's illness. The work was demanding, but satisfying, in a way that caregiving had never been. I was helping people, but I was also getting paid for it. I had colleagues who respected my expertise. I had regular hours and lunch breaks, and the ability to leave work at work. Most importantly, I was using skills I'd developed through pure necessity to actually help other people avoid some of the pitfalls I'd encountered. My supervisor, Dr. Patricia Williams, was impressed by my knowledge of Medicare regulations and my ability to communicate complex medical information to stressed families. "Most people in this role have formal training in social work or healthcare administration," she told me after my first month. "You have something better. You have lived experience. Families trust you because you've been where they are." It was the first time in years that someone had acknowledged my caregiving experience as professionally valuable rather than just personally admirable. I started taking classes at Seattle Central College, working toward a certificate in healthcare administration that would qualify me for advancement opportunities. For the first time since Dad's diagnosis, I had goals that extended beyond getting through the next day. Meanwhile, my phone stayed mercifully quiet. I'd blocked Marcus and Jessica's numbers, and Mom seemed to have gotten the message that I wasn't interested in reconciliation conversations. The silence felt like freedom. No more crisis calls, no more guilt trips, no more explanations about why I couldn't drop everything to handle someone else's emergency. But silence, I discovered, works both ways. Just as I wasn't hearing from them, they weren't hearing from me. And apparently, my absence was starting to create problems they hadn't anticipated. The first sign came through my old neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who'd lived next door to us on Maple Street for 20 years. She found my new number somehow and called on a Tuesday evening, her voice tight with concern. "Eunice, dear, I hope you don't mind me calling. I got your number from that nice visiting nurse, Carol. I'm worried about your mother. She's been asking me strange questions about Robert's medications and medical equipment. Yesterday, she wanted to know if I knew how to work the oxygen concentrator. I told her she should call you, but she said you weren't available." Mrs. Patterson paused, and I could hear her choosing her words carefully. "Honey, I think she's trying to handle things that are too complicated for her. The other day I saw her in the yard at 10 o'clock at night, looking for something with a flashlight. When I asked if she needed help, she said she'd lost some important papers and couldn't remember where Robert kept his medical files." A cold feeling settled in my stomach. During Dad's illness, I'd been the one who organized all his medical records, insurance paperwork, and equipment manuals. I'd created detailed files for everything, from medication schedules to warranty information for his medical devices. But those files were useless if no one knew how to read them or where to find them. "Is she sick?" I asked Mrs. Patterson. "Does she need medical attention?" "Oh no, nothing like that. She's just lost, I think. Like she doesn't know how to manage things without you there." I offered to help, but she's too proud to accept it. She keeps saying she should be able to figure it out herself, that she lived in that house for 30 years and raised 3 children. After Mrs. Patterson hung up, I sat in my small apartment feeling conflicted. Part of me wanted to call Mom and offer guidance. The responsible daughter in me, the one who'd been trained to solve everyone's problems, felt guilty for leaving her to struggle alone. But the part of me that was still angry, still hurt, reminded me that she'd had 4 years to learn about Dad's care routine and had chosen to remain willfully ignorant. I'd tried to include her in medical appointments and care decisions. I'd created simple checklists and written instructions for basic tasks. I'd offered to teach her how to use Dad's equipment and manage his medications. But she'd always deferred to me, saying she was too overwhelmed or too emotional to handle the technical aspects of his care. Now, apparently, she was discovering what it actually meant to be responsible for someone else's complex medical needs. The knowledge that had seemed so naturally suited to my personality was turning out to be learned skills that required practice and attention to develop. I decided not to call. Whatever Mom was struggling with, it wasn't my emergency anymore. She had Marcus and Jessica to help her, if she was willing to ask for it. Or she could hire professionals, the way other people did when they needed expertise they didn't possess. My role as the family's unpaid medical coordinator had ended with Dad's death and my departure from Portland. 2 weeks later, Carol called me directly. I'd given her my new number before leaving Portland, partly because she'd been one of the few people who'd understood what I was going through, and partly because she'd mentioned that if I ever wanted to work in healthcare, she'd be happy to provide a reference. "Eunice, I'm sorry to bother you, but I wanted to give you a heads up. Your mother called our agency asking if we could provide someone to help her organize Robert's medical records and dispose of his equipment properly. She seemed very confused about what could be donated and what needed special disposal because of contamination risks." Carol's voice was gentle but professional. I explained that we don't typically provide organizational services, but I gave her the names of some companies that specialize in medical equipment disposal. The thing is, she kept asking if I thought you might come back to help, just for a day or two. She said she'd pay you for your time, The offer to pay me stung more than I'd expected. For 4 years, my time and expertise had been freely given and freely received. Now that it was no longer available, suddenly it had monetary value. It felt like being offered wages for something that should have been compensated all along. I told her I didn't think that was likely, Carol continued, but I wanted you to know in case she tries to contact you directly. I also wanted you to know that Marcus called our office too. He was asking about hiring a nurse to help his mother with some tasks, but when I explained our rates, he seemed shocked. I don't think he realized how expensive professional caregiving services are. After Carol hung up, I looked up the rates for private duty nursing in the Portland area. $800 to $1,200 per week for basic assistance with activities of daily living. $1,500 to $2,000 per week for skilled nursing care. Over the course of Dad's 4-year illness, my unpaid labor had probably been worth somewhere between $200,000 and $300,000. Marcus had sent maybe $30,000 in total over those 4 years. Jessica had contributed even less. Mom had provided housing and utilities, but those were costs she would have incurred anyway. The bulk of Dad's care, the most expensive and demanding part, had been provided free of charge by me. No wonder they'd been so comfortable with the arrangement. From their perspective, Dad was receiving excellent care at a fraction of what it would have cost to hire professionals. They could feel good about their limited contributions because someone else was picking up the slack. They could maintain their own lives and careers because someone else had sacrificed theirs. But now that someone else was gone, and they were discovering what it actually cost to replace the services I'd provided for free, Jessica was the next to reach out, though she had to work harder to find me since I'd blocked her number. She sent a message through LinkedIn, of all places, where I'd been building a professional profile focused on healthcare advocacy and patient rights. Eunice, I found your profile and I'm so proud of what you're building in Seattle. I know you're probably still angry with us, and I don't blame you. The will situation was horrible and unfair. But right now, Mom really needs help, and Marcus and I don't know what to do. Could we maybe talk? I could drive up to Seattle this weekend. I stared at the message for a long time before responding. I'm not angry, Jessica. I'm busy building a life. I hope you figure out how to help Mom the same way I figured out how to help Dad. Good luck. Her response came within minutes. That's not fair. You always knew more about Dad's medical stuff than the rest of us. We couldn't just abandon our lives the way you did. Some of us had responsibilities. I screenshot that message and saved it, not out of spite, but because it perfectly encapsulated the attitude that had defined my family's approach to Dad's illness. My life was apparently more abandonment-worthy than theirs. My career was less important than Marcus's startup ambitions. My relationship with David was more expendable than Jessica's influencer dreams. My sacrifice was expected because my life had less value. The irony was that Jessica was right about one thing. I had known more about Dad's medical situation than the rest of them. But that knowledge hadn't been innate or genetic. I'd learned it through necessity, through showing up day after day and asking questions and making mistakes and gradually developing expertise. That knowledge could have been shared if anyone else had been interested in acquiring it. But sharing the knowledge would have meant sharing the responsibility, and that was something they'd never been willing to do. It was easier to designate me as the naturally suited caregiver, and then use my expertise as justification for their absence. A month later, Mrs. Patterson called again. This time, her voice carried real concern rather than just neighborly worry. Eunice, I hate to bother you again, but I think you should know what's happening over here. Your mother had some kind of episode last week. I saw an ambulance at the house, and when I asked her about it later, she said she'd had chest pains and thought she was having a heart attack. Mrs. Patterson's voice dropped to a whisper, as if Mom might be listening. It turned out to be a panic attack, but she was convinced she was dying. She told the paramedics she didn't know what would happen to Robert's things if something happened. To her, that no one else knew how to handle his affairs. Eunice, she's been carrying around a manila folder full of his medical records, taking them everywhere like she's afraid to lose them. The image of Mom clutching Dad's medical files struck me as both sad and infuriating. Those were the same files she'd shown no interest in when Dad was alive, when understanding them might have actually been useful. Now she was treating them like sacred artifacts, evidence of a caregiving knowledge she'd never bothered to acquire. "Has she asked Marcus or Jessica for help?" I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. "Well, that's the thing. Marcus did come down last weekend with his girlfriend. I saw them loading some of Robert's equipment into a truck. But on Sunday, I heard shouting from the house. Later, Linda told me that Marcus got frustrated because she couldn't explain how some of the equipment worked or which pieces were still under warranty." Mrs. Patterson sighed. "Jessica came by too, but she left after just a few hours. Linda said she got upset when she saw how much work was involved in sorting through everything. Apparently, she had some event to attend back in Portland and couldn't stay to help. It was exactly what I'd expected. When helping required more than good intentions and sympathetic words, when it demanded actual time and effort and uncomfortable conversations about medical equipment and insurance policies, my siblings had discovered they had other priorities. The thing is," Mrs. Patterson continued, "Linda keeps saying that if you were there, you'd know exactly what to do. She's convinced that you have some kind of special knowledge that the rest of them don't have. But from what I could see, it's not that complicated. It's just time-consuming and detail-oriented work." She was absolutely right. The tasks Mom was struggling with weren't rocket science. They were the same organizational and administrative skills that any competent adult could develop with patience and attention. The difference was that I'd been forced to develop those skills under pressure, while Dad was still alive and needed care. I'd learned by doing, because someone had to do it and no one else was willing. Now, Mom was trying to learn the same skills. After the fact, when the stakes felt lower but the emotional weight was heavier. She was dealing with the remnants of Dad's illness without having lived through the process of managing it. She was trying to understand systems and procedures that I'd developed over months and years of trial and error. But more than that, she was dealing with the guilt of realizing how much work she'd avoided during Dad's actual illness. Every piece of equipment she couldn't identify, every medication she couldn't explain, every insurance form she couldn't decipher was evidence of her own absence from Dad's care. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. The phone calls and messages continued sporadically over the next few months. Sometimes from Mrs. Patterson, sometimes from other neighbors or family friends who'd been roped into helping Mom with various tasks. Each conversation painted the same picture. A woman overwhelmed by responsibilities she'd never had to handle before, frustrated by her own ignorance of systems that had been running smoothly in the background for years. Marcus hired a professional organizer to help Mom sort through Dad's medical equipment and records. The organizer charged $300 an hour and took 2 full days to accomplish what I could have done in an afternoon, if I'd been willing to do it. But I wasn't, and that unwillingness felt like the first boundary I'd set in years that was actually being respected. Jessica tried a different approach, posting on social media about the challenges of dealing with a loved one's medical legacy. "Going through my father's things and realizing how much I didn't know about his care routine," she wrote. "Grateful for all the healthcare workers who help families navigate these difficult transitions. It's so much more complicated than I realized." The post got dozens of sympathetic comments from her followers, people praising her for being vulnerable and authentic about the grief process. Someone even suggested she create content about elder care planning, positioning herself as an advocate for better family communication around health issues. I screenshot that post too, adding it to a growing collection of evidence that my family was very good at performing grief and learning and growth for public consumption, but less good at actually doing the work required to support each other. The most telling conversation came from Carol, who called to check in on me and mentioned that she'd run into Marcus at a medical supply store in Portland. "He was returning some of your father's equipment," she said. "Apparently, he'd been trying to donate it, but most places won't accept used medical equipment unless it's been properly cleaned and certified." He seemed frustrated by all the paperwork and regulations involved. Carol paused, and I could hear her weighing her words. "He asked me if I thought you might consider coming back to help, just as a consultant. He said they'd pay you whatever the going rate was for medical equipment consultation." When I told him that kind of expertise usually costs several $100s an hour, he looked shocked. It was the same pattern again. My knowledge and skills were valuable enough to pay for, now that they were no longer freely available. But during the 4 years when they would have been most useful, when Dad was actually alive and needed care, that same expertise had been taken for granted as just part of my personality. The irony was that if they'd bothered to learn any of this information while Dad was alive, they wouldn't need expensive consultants now. If they'd participated in his care instead of delegating it entirely to me, they'd understand his equipment and medications and insurance policies. Their current crisis was entirely of their own making. But I also knew that pointing this out would accomplish nothing except making me look petty and vindictive. They were finally experiencing the consequences of their choices, learning firsthand what it meant to be responsible for complex medical and administrative tasks. No lecture from me could be more educational than the reality they were currently living. So I stayed silent and stayed away. I let them figure out how to handle Dad's medical legacy, the same way I'd figured out how to handle his actual care. Through research and trial and error and the gradual accumulation of knowledge that comes from showing up consistently and paying attention to details. The difference was that I'd learned those skills while also providing emotional support to a scared and dying man. They were learning them while dealing with paperwork and equipment, challenging but not heartbreaking in the same way. Meanwhile, my own life was expanding in ways I hadn't experienced in years. I was promoted to senior patient advocate after 6 months at Swedish Medical Center. I was invited to speak at a conference about family dynamics in long-term care, sharing insights I'd gained from both personal and professional experience. I started dating again, tentatively at first, but with a newfound appreciation for relationships that were reciprocal rather than one-sided. My supervisor, Dr. Williams, nominated me for a leadership development program that would cover the cost of completing my bachelor's degree in healthcare administration. "You have natural leadership abilities," she said during my performance review. "You understand both the technical and emotional aspects of healthcare in a way that's rare. I think you could go very far in this field." It was strange to hear my caregiving experience described as leadership potential rather than just personal sacrifice. For years, I'd thought of what I'd done for Dad as private family business, important but not professionally relevant. Now I was discovering that the skills I'd developed were actually valuable in the broader healthcare field. I was building something that belonged entirely to me, something that honored the difficult years I'd spent caring for Dad, while also creating a future that wasn't defined by that experience. I was helping other families avoid some of the pitfalls I'd encountered, advocating for better communication between healthcare providers and family members, and working to improve systems that too often left families to figure things out on their own. For the first time since Dad's diagnosis, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Not because someone needed me to be there, but because I'd chosen to be there. Not because I was the only one willing to handle a difficult situation, but because I was good at handling difficult situations and wanted to use that ability to help others. The silence from my family had stopped feeling like rejection and started feeling like freedom. Freedom to build a life based on my own choices rather than their expectations. Freedom to use my skills in ways that were appreciated and compensated rather than taken for granted. Freedom to help people who were grateful for my expertise rather than resentful of my absence. They'd given me nothing at the will reading, but in a strange way, that nothing had turned out to be exactly what I needed. It had forced me to stop waiting for recognition that would never come and start building recognition for myself. It had pushed me to leave a situation where I was undervalued and find one where my contributions mattered. Most importantly, it had taught me that love without respect is just exploitation with better marketing. And I was done being exploited, even by people who claimed to love me. The email arrived on a Wednesday morning while I was reviewing patient files at my desk. The subject line read, "Speaking Opportunity, National Healthcare Conference," and I almost deleted it, assuming it was spam. But something made me open it, and I'm glad I did. Dear Ms. Chen, we received your name from Dr. Patricia Williams at Swedish Medical Center. We understand you have unique insights into family caregiving dynamics and patient advocacy. Would you be interested in presenting at our annual conference in Denver? The theme this year is Bridging the Gap Between Professional Height and Family Care. We believe your perspective would be invaluable to our audience of healthcare administrators, social workers, and policymakers. I read the message 3 times before it sank in. Someone wanted to hear what I had to say. Not just as a favor to fill time, but because they believed my experience had value for other professionals in the field. The honorarium they offered was more than I made in a week at my regular job. Dr. Williams was delighted when I told her about the invitation. "This is exactly the kind of recognition you deserve," she said. "Your work here has been exceptional, but this will give you a platform to influence the field on a much larger scale. I hope you'll accept." The weeks leading up to the conference were a whirlwind of preparation. I'd never given a professional presentation before, let alone to an audience of hundreds of healthcare experts. But as I worked on my speech, I realized I had something powerful to share. I had lived through the gap between professional and family care from both sides. I understood what families needed from healthcare systems, and I understood what healthcare systems needed from families. My presentation was titled, "The Invisible Caregiver: How Family Dynamics Impact Long-Term Care Outcomes." I talked about the assumptions healthcare providers make about family involvement and the assumptions families make about their own capabilities. I talked about the hidden costs of designating one family member as the primary caregiver and the ripple effects when that system breaks down. But I also talked about solutions, ways that healthcare teams could better assess family dynamics and provide appropriate support, ways that families could share caregiving responsibilities more equitably, ways that systems could be designed to prevent caregiver burnout and family dysfunction. The response was overwhelming. After my presentation, I was surrounded by people wanting to know more. Social workers who recognized the patterns I'd described in their own caseloads, hospital administrators who wanted to implement some of my suggestions for family communication protocols, researchers who were interested in studying the long-term outcomes for families like mine. A woman named Dr. Sarah Martinez approached me as the crowd was dispersing. She was a geriatrician who also served on the board of the National Alliance for Caregiving. "Your presentation was extraordinary," she said. "Have you considered writing about these issues? I think your voice could really influence policy discussions around family caregiving support." Writing had never occurred to me, but Dr. Martinez's suggestion planted a seed. Over the next few months, I started contributing articles to healthcare journals and caregiving organizations. My first piece, "The Myth of the Natural Caregiver," was published in the Journal of Family Healthcare and was cited in several academic papers about caregiving burden. The article explored how families and healthcare systems perpetuate the idea that some people are naturally suited for caregiving, and how this myth prevents equitable distribution of caregiving responsibilities. I used research to support points I'd learned through lived experience, showing how the natural caregiver designation often falls along gender lines and can lead to significant physical, emotional, and financial consequences for the designated caregiver. The response to the article was immediate and intense. I received emails from family caregivers across the country who recognized their own situations in my writing. Healthcare providers shared the article with colleagues and families. Caregiving organizations invited me to speak at their events and contribute to their publications. Within a year, I'd become a recognized voice in the field of family caregiving advocacy. I was invited to serve on advisory boards, consult with healthcare systems on family communication protocols, and contribute to policy discussions about caregiver support services. The work was fulfilling in a way I'd never experienced before. I was using my painful experience to prevent other families from going through the same destructive patterns. My personal life was flourishing too. I'd met someone, a social worker named David, who worked with elderly clients and understood the demands of caregiving work. We'd connected over coffee after one of my presentations, and he'd impressed me with his genuine interest in the systemic issues I was working to address. Unlike my previous relationship, this one was built on mutual respect and shared values rather than one person constantly accommodating the other's needs. David had his own experience with family caregiving. His grandmother had lived with his family during her final years, and he'd watched his mother struggle with many of the same issues I'd faced with Dad. But his family had handled it differently, rotating responsibilities among siblings and bringing in professional help when needed. Talking with him helped me understand that my family's approach hadn't been inevitable. There were other ways to handle these situations, healthier ways that preserved relationships rather than destroying them. The apartment in Capitol Hill had been replaced by a small house in the Wallingford neighborhood, complete with a home office where I could write and prepare presentations. I was earning enough from my combination of patient advocacy work, speaking fees, and writing contracts to live comfortably for the first time in years. More importantly, I was building something that felt sustainable and meaningful. The contrast with my old life was stark. Instead of being invisible and taken for granted, I was being sought out for my expertise. Instead of giving my time and energy away for free, I was being compensated fairly for my contributions. Instead of having my needs constantly subordinated to someone else's crisis, I was in relationships where reciprocity was expected and maintained. But the most significant change was internal. I'd stopped apologizing for taking up space, stopped minimizing my own needs, stopped accepting treatment that didn't meet my standards. The 4 years of caregiving had taught me what I was capable of enduring, but the years since had taught me that endurance wasn't the same as acceptance. I could handle difficult situations without accepting that difficulty was all I deserved. My work was getting national attention. I was invited to testify before a congressional subcommittee about the need for federal support for family caregivers. The experience was intimidating but exhilarating. Sitting in that formal hearing room, speaking into a microphone while congresspeople took notes, I felt like I was finally using my voice in the way it was meant to be used. Family caregiving is often invisible labor, I told the subcommittee. We estimate its value at over $400 billion annually, but we provide almost no systematic support for the people providing this care. This isn't just a family issue or a healthcare issue. It's an economic issue that affects workforce participation, retirement security, and long-term healthcare costs. I talked about the need for respite care services, caregiver training programs, and workplace policies that acknowledged caregiving responsibilities. I talked about the importance of early intervention to prevent family dysfunction and caregiver burnout. I shared statistics about the physical and mental health impacts of long-term caregiving and the ripple effects when caregiving arrangements collapse. But I also talked about my own experience, carefully and professionally, as an example of what happens when families assume one person can handle everything alone. I didn't mention names or assign blame, but I illustrated the human cost of systems that rely on unpaid, unsupported family labor to function. The testimony was covered by several news outlets, and suddenly I was fielding interview requests from journalists and researchers. A producer from NPR wanted to do a segment about my work for their health coverage. A documentary filmmaker was interested in featuring my story in a film about family caregiving. Publishers were reaching out about the possibility of a book. The attention was gratifying, but also overwhelming. I was still learning how to navigate the difference between sharing my expertise and exploiting my personal story. There were opportunities that felt authentic and meaningful, and others that felt like they were asking me to perform my trauma for other people's entertainment. Dr. Williams helped me think through these decisions. "You have something valuable to offer," she said, "but you also have boundaries that deserve respect. Don't let anyone pressure you into sharing more than you're comfortable with, even if they frame it as helping other people." Her advice proved prescient when a major morning show invited me to appear in a segment about difficult family dynamics during the holidays. The producer assured me it would be a serious discussion about caregiving challenges, but when I saw the other guests they'd booked, I realized they were looking for dramatic personal stories rather than substantive policy discussion. I declined the invitation and instead accepted an offer to write an op-ed for the Washington Post about caregiving during the holiday season. The op-ed, titled "When Family Caregiving Becomes Family Fracturing," was published the week before Thanksgiving and generated hundreds of comments and shares. In it, I explored how holiday gatherings can expose and exacerbate existing inequities in family caregiving arrangements, and offered practical suggestions for families dealing with these dynamics. The relative who bears the greatest caregiving burden during the year often finds holidays particularly challenging, I wrote. They may feel resentful when siblings who provide minimal day-to-day support arrive expecting to be praised for their holiday visit. They may struggle with the performance of family harmony when their experience has been one of isolation and overwhelming responsibility. The piece resonated with readers because it named something that many families experience but rarely discuss openly. I received messages from people who said they'd felt less alone after reading it, that it had helped them understand their own family dynamics, that it had given them language to talk about difficult situations. But the most meaningful response came from an unexpected source. Dr. Martinez, the geriatrician who'd first encouraged me to write, forwarded me a message from a colleague who worked in policy development for the Department of Health and Human Services. "We've been following Ms. Chen's work with great interest," the message read. "Would she be available to consult on some upcoming initiatives related to family caregiver support? We're developing new guidelines for healthcare systems and would value her input on the family dynamics component." The consultation work led to more opportunities. I was invited to join working groups developing caregiver assessment tools and family communication protocols. Healthcare systems across the country were implementing programs based on recommendations I'd helped develop. My ideas were being translated into policies that would affect thousands of families dealing with similar situations to what I'd experienced. The irony wasn't lost on me. The experience that had felt like such a dead end, such a waste of my potential, was turning out to be the foundation for the most meaningful work of my life. The skills I'd developed out of necessity were becoming tools for systemic change. The isolation and frustration I'd felt were being transformed into insights that could help other families avoid similar pain. I was invited to keynote the annual Conference of the National Alliance for Caregiving, the same organization where Dr. Martinez served on the board. The audience was a mix of caregivers, healthcare professionals, and policy advocates, and I felt more nervous than I had for any previous presentation. These were people who lived and breathed caregiving issues every day. They would know immediately if I was authentic or performing. My speech was titled, "From Invisible to Influential: How Personal Experience Can Drive Systemic Change." I talked about the journey from being an overwhelmed family caregiver to becoming a recognized advocate in the field. I talked about the importance of lived experience in shaping policy and practice. I talked about the responsibility that comes with having a platform and a voice. But I also talked about the ongoing challenges. How success in advocacy work didn't erase the pain of what I'd been through with my family. How professional recognition didn't automatically heal personal relationships. How becoming an expert on family dynamics hadn't made my own family dynamics any less complicated. "I want to be clear about something," I said toward the end of my speech. "The work we do in this field is important and necessary, but it's not a fairy tale. Personal transformation doesn't always lead to relationship reconciliation. Professional success doesn't automatically heal family wounds. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is create boundaries that protect your own well-being, even if other people interpret those boundaries as abandonment. The standing ovation lasted for several minutes, but what meant more to me were the conversations afterward. Caregivers who thanked me for acknowledging that love sometimes requires distance. Healthcare providers who said my presentation had changed how they thought about family assessment and intervention. Researchers who wanted to collaborate on projects that would give voice to caregiver experiences. A journalist from USA Today was there and asked for an interview about my career transition from family caregiver to national advocate. The resulting article, published a few weeks later, was titled, "From Bedside to Boardroom: How One Woman's Caregiving Experience Became a Movement." The article included a photo of me in my office at Swedish Medical Center, surrounded by the awards and certificates I'd earned over the past few years. Looking at that photo, I could barely recognize the exhausted, isolated woman I'd been during Dad's illness. Not just because of the professional setting or the confident expression, but because of the sense of purpose and agency that radiated from the image. The article was picked up by other outlets and shared widely on social media. I started receiving messages from family caregivers around the world who had found inspiration in my story. Some were just starting their caregiving journeys and wanted advice about how to protect their own well-being. Others were years into the process and struggling with resentment and burnout. Still others had finished their caregiving responsibilities and were trying to figure out how to rebuild their lives. Each message reminded me why this work mattered. Every family caregiver who felt seen and understood. Every healthcare provider who changed their approach to family assessment. Every policymaker who incorporated caregiver perspectives into their planning represented progress toward a system that better supported families in crisis. But success also brought unexpected challenges. As my profile grew, I started receiving invitations to events and opportunities that would have required me to return to Portland. Conference organizers wanted me to speak at local hospitals. Researchers wanted to interview my former colleagues and neighbors. Media outlets wanted to visit the house where I'd cared for Dad. I declined all of these requests, but they served as reminders that my past was still there, still connected to people who might have opinions about my current success. I wondered, sometimes, what my family thought about the articles and interviews, whether they recognized themselves in my carefully anonymized descriptions of family dynamics, whether they understood that my work was a direct result of the experience they'd dismissed as just part of my personality. The wondering became more pressing when Mrs. Patterson called again, this time with news that Mom had been bragging to neighbors about my success. "She showed me that article from USA Today," Mrs. Patterson said. "She was so proud, telling everyone that you'd always been special, that she'd known you'd do something important with your life. It was like she'd completely forgotten about the difficult time after Robert passed, when she was so overwhelmed and frustrated." The conversation left me feeling unsettled. It was one thing for Mom to rewrite history in her own mind, but quite another for her to do it publicly, especially in a way that positioned her as a supportive mother who'd always believed in my potential. The reality was that she'd never shown any interest in my professional development or personal goals. For 4 years, my identity in her eyes had been entirely defined by my usefulness as Dad's caregiver. But I also realized that Mom's revisionist narrative said more about her own need to feel good about herself than it did about me. She was constructing a story that allowed her to take pride in my success, without examining her own role in the circumstances that had led to it. It was easier to claim credit for my achievements than to acknowledge the pain that had motivated them. I decided not to correct the record, not because I didn't care about the truth, but because I no longer needed her acknowledgement or approval to validate my experience. My success wasn't for her or because of her. It was in spite of the situation she'd helped create, and it belonged entirely to me. The distance I'd maintained from my family had given me the space to build something authentic and meaningful. I was helping families avoid the mistakes mine had made, advocating for systemic changes that would prevent other caregivers from experiencing the isolation and exploitation I'd endured. I was using my voice to influence policy and practice in ways that honored the difficulty of what I'd been through, while also creating something positive from that pain. Most importantly, I was living a life that reflected my own values and priorities, rather than other people's expectations. I was in relationships that were reciprocal and respectful. I was doing work that was appreciated and fairly compensated. I was building a legacy that would outlast any individual relationship or family dynamic. The girl who had sat silently in that law office while her family divided up her father's estate without including her had grown into a woman whose voice was sought out by national media and policymakers. The expertise that had been taken for granted in my family was now valued and respected in professional settings. The sacrifices that had been dismissed as just part of my character were now recognized as valuable experience that could benefit thousands of other families. I hadn't just survived the betrayal of that will reading. I'd transformed it into fuel for building something bigger and more meaningful than anything I could have inherited. And that transformation belonged entirely to me. The invitation arrived on elegant, cream-colored paper, the kind that whispered importance before you even read the words. The American Healthcare Association cordially invites you to attend the National Excellence in Patient Advocacy Awards ceremony. You have been selected as this year's recipient of the Distinguished Service Award for your groundbreaking work in family caregiving advocacy. I held the invitation for a long time, running my fingers over the embossed lettering. 5 years ago, I'd been sitting in a law office learning that my family considered me worth nothing. Now I was being recognized at the national level for work that had grown directly from that devastating experience. The ceremony would be held in Washington, D.C., with an audience of healthcare leaders, policymakers, and advocates from across the country. David found me in the kitchen that evening, still staring at the invitation. "This is incredible, Eunice. Do you realize what this means? You're not just being recognized for your work. You're being celebrated as someone who's changed the entire conversation around family caregiving." He was right, though it was still hard for me to fully absorb the magnitude of what had happened. My book, The Weight of Caring: How Families Can Share the Load Without Breaking Apart, had been published 6 months earlier and was already being used in social work programs and medical schools across the country. The caregiver assessment, tools I'd helped develop, were being implemented in hospitals nationwide. The policy recommendations I'd contributed to had influenced federal legislation providing tax credits and support services for family caregivers. But beyond the professional achievements, something else had shifted. I no longer felt like someone who had survived a terrible experience. I felt like someone who had transformed that experience into something valuable and lasting. The pain hadn't disappeared, but it had been alchemized into purpose. The weeks leading up to the award ceremony were filled with interview requests and speaking opportunities. A major news network wanted to do a feature story about my journey from family caregiver to national advocate. The National Institutes of Health invited me to join a research advisory board studying the long-term health impacts of caregiving. Harvard Medical School asked me to deliver a guest lecture to their geriatrics fellowship program. Each opportunity felt surreal. 5 years earlier, I'd been invisible to everyone except the person who needed care. Now, my voice was being amplified. On national stages, my expertise was being sought by the most prestigious institutions in healthcare, and my story was inspiring policy changes that would affect millions of families. The irony wasn't lost on me that all of this recognition was built on skills I'd developed while being completely undervalued by the people closest to me. The family who had dismissed my caregiving abilities as just part of my personality were probably watching me receive national awards for those same abilities. The relatives who had treated my expertise as unremarkable were seeing it validated by the highest levels of the healthcare establishment. 3 days before the award ceremony, I received an unexpected phone call. The caller ID showed a Portland number I didn't recognize, and I almost let it go to voicemail. But something made me answer. "Eunice, this is Dr. Thompson, your father's old lawyer. I hope you don't mind me calling. I got your number from Carol, the visiting nurse. I wanted to congratulate you on your award. I've been following your work in the healthcare journals, and I'm incredibly impressed by what you've accomplished." Dr. Thompson's voice was warm, but carried an undertone of something that might have been regret. "I also wanted to tell you something that I probably should have said years ago. When your father was planning his will, I strongly advised him to include provisions for you. I told him that your caregiving contributions deserved recognition, if not financially, then at least symbolically." I felt my breath catch. This was information I'd never expected to receive, context that reframed everything I thought I knew about Dad's final decisions. "What did he say?" I asked, though part of me wasn't sure I wanted to know. Dr. Thompson sighed deeply. "He said that you were the strongest of his children, that you'd always been able to handle whatever life threw at you. He believed that leaving you inheritance money would somehow diminish your independence. He was convinced that you'd find your own way and that it would be better than anything he could give you." The words hit me like a physical blow. Dad hadn't excluded me because he didn't value my contributions. He'd excluded me because he valued my resilience more than my need for recognition. In his mind, giving me money would have been an insult to my capabilities, a suggestion that I needed support in the same way that Marcus and Jessica did. "I tried to explain that recognition isn't about need," Dr. Thompson continued. "I told him that acknowledging your sacrifices would be important for family harmony and your own sense of being valued, but he was adamant. He said you'd understand. Eventually, that you'd see he was giving you something better than money." After hanging up, I sat in my office for hours processing this new information. Part of me felt vindicated. Dad had seen my strength and independence, had believed in my ability to build something meaningful from nothing. But another part of me felt frustrated that he'd made such a unilateral decision about what would be best for me, without ever asking what I actually wanted or needed. The conversation also clarified something I'd been struggling to understand. Dad's decision hadn't been about favoritism or lack of love. It had been about his own complicated relationship with independence and self-reliance. He'd genuinely believed that forcing me to forge my own path would result in greater success than giving me a head start with inheritance money. In a twisted way, he'd been right. The financial desperation that followed his death had pushed me to discover capabilities I might never have developed otherwise. The anger and hurt had motivated me to build something entirely my own rather than settling for a comfortable but limited existence managing inherited assets. But his being right about the outcome didn't make his decision any less painful or problematic. He'd gambled with my well-being based on his own philosophical beliefs about character development, without considering the immediate human cost of that gamble. He'd prioritized some abstract ideal of independence over my need to feel valued and acknowledged. The night before the awards ceremony, David and I flew to Washington, D.C. and checked into a hotel near the Kennedy Center where the event would be held. As I hung up my dress for the ceremony, a simple but elegant black design that I'd chosen specifically because it made me feel confident and professional, I thought about how different this moment was from anything I could have imagined 5 years earlier. The woman who had packed her life into cardboard boxes and driven away from Portland in defeat was about to be celebrated on a national stage. The expertise that had been taken for granted was about to be honored by the most prestigious organization in American healthcare. The voice that had been silenced was about to address an audience of hundreds of influential professionals. The Kennedy Center was magnificent, all soaring ceilings and elegant architecture that made every sound seem important. I'd attended conferences and meetings in impressive venues before, but this felt different. This wasn't just another speaking engagement or professional networking event. This was recognition at the highest level of my field. As I walked into the reception before the ceremony, I was approached by people I'd only read about in healthcare. Journals and Policy Reports. Dr. Margaret Chen, the Surgeon General's Chief Health Policy Advisor, wanted to discuss my research on caregiver burnout. The director of the National Institute on Aging asked about my upcoming projects. A documentary filmmaker who'd won an Emmy for her work on healthcare issues wanted to explore collaborating on a project about family caregiving. But the most meaningful interaction came from an unexpected source. A young woman in her early 30s approached me during the cocktail hour, her eyes bright with nervous energy. "Ms. Chen, I'm Sarah Williams. I'm a social worker in Phoenix, and I wanted to thank you. Your book literally saved my family. My mother was diagnosed with Alzheimer's last year, and we were falling into exactly the pattern you described. One person doing everything while everyone else found excuses to stay away." Sarah's voice was steady but emotional. "After reading your book, we had a family meeting and completely restructured our approach to Mom's care. We divided responsibilities, set up respite schedules, and brought in professional help. It's still hard, but nobody's drowning anymore. And more importantly, we're still speaking to each other." These were the moments that made everything worthwhile. Not the awards or media attention, but the knowledge that my work was preventing other families from experiencing the painful dynamics that had torn mine apart. Every family that found a better way to share caregiving responsibilities represented a small victory against the systems and assumptions that had made my own experience so isolating. The award ceremony itself was a blur of speeches and presentations, recognitions for achievements across every aspect of healthcare advocacy. When my name was called, I walked to the podium feeling simultaneously nervous and completely prepared. This was what I'd been building toward for 5 years, the culmination of every article I'd written, every speech I'd given, every policy discussion I'd contributed to. "When I started caring for my father 5 years ago," I began, "I thought I was just doing what families do. I thought the exhaustion and isolation I felt were just part of the process, unfortunate but inevitable consequences of loving someone who was dying." I looked out at the audience, hundreds of faces representing every corner of the healthcare system. I was wrong. The suffering I experienced wasn't inevitable. It was the result of systems and assumptions that place impossible burdens on individual family members while providing almost no support or recognition for their contributions. I talked about the economic value of family caregiving, the $400 billion in unpaid labor that kept the healthcare system functioning. I talked about the physical and mental health consequences for caregivers who receive no support or respite. I talked about the family dysfunction that results when caregiving responsibilities are distributed unfairly, but I also talked about solutions. The assessment tools that help healthcare teams identify at-risk family dynamics. The policy changes that provide financial and practical support for caregivers. The training programs that help families share responsibilities more equitably. The work we do in this field isn't just about improving healthcare outcomes, I said. It's about preserving families and protecting the people who sacrifice everything to care for their loved ones. It's about recognizing that love without support isn't sustainable, and that good intentions without systematic change aren't enough. The applause was thunderous, but what moved me most was seeing people in the audience wiping away tears. These were healthcare professionals who dealt with family caregiving issues every day, and they understood exactly what I was talking about. They'd seen the families torn apart by unsustainable caregiving arrangements. They'd witnessed the burnout and resentment that resulted from placing all responsibility on one person. After the ceremony, the reception was filled with congratulations and conversation. People wanted to discuss collaborations, share their own experiences with family caregiving, and talk about how my work had influenced their practice. I felt energized rather than drained by all the social interaction, a stark contrast to how overwhelmed I used to feel in large groups during Dad's illness. The next morning, David and I were having breakfast in the hotel restaurant when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Eunice, this is Jessica. I saw the news coverage of your award ceremony. I'm so proud of what you've accomplished. I know we haven't talked in years, but I wanted you to know that Marcus and I realize we failed you during Dad's illness. We were selfish and immature, and we left you to handle everything alone. We're sorry." I stared at the message for a long time, feeling a complicated mix of emotions. Part of me was gratified that they finally understood what they'd put me through. Part of me was angry that it had taken national recognition for them to acknowledge their failures. Part of me was sad that it had come too late to repair the relationship. But mostly, I felt indifferent. Their apology didn't change what had happened or undo the damage that had been done. It didn't restore the 4 years I'd lost or the relationship I'd sacrificed or the financial security I'd given up. More importantly, it didn't change the person I'd become or the life I'd built since leaving Portland. I showed the message to David, who read it thoughtfully before looking up at me. "How do you feel about that?" "I don't know," I said honestly. "I'm glad they understand now what they did wrong. But understanding after the fact isn't the same as showing up when it mattered. And their apology doesn't obligate me to forgive them or reconnect with them." David nodded. "You don't owe them anything, Eunice. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, not even a response. You've built something incredible from a terrible situation, and you did it without their help. Whether or not you want them in your life now is entirely your choice." I deleted the message without responding, not out of spite, but because I'd moved beyond needing their acknowledgement or approval. Their recognition of their failures was something they needed for their own peace of mind, not something I needed for mine. The flight back to Seattle gave me time to process everything that had happened over the past few days. The award ceremony had been meaningful, but the real satisfaction came from knowing that my work was making a difference for other families. The policy changes I'd influenced were preventing other caregivers from experiencing the isolation I'd felt. The assessment tools I'd helped develop were identifying at-risk families before their dynamics became destructive. Most importantly, I'd proven something to myself that I'd never been entirely sure of during those dark years of caregiving. I was more than just someone who endured difficult situations. I was someone who could transform difficult situations into opportunities for growth and change, both personally and systematically. The house in Wallingford felt like home in a way that the house on Maple Street never had, even during my childhood. This was a space I'd chosen and created, filled with reminders of what I'd accomplished rather than what I'd endured. The walls were covered with awards and certificates, photos from speaking engagements, and letters from families who'd been helped by my work. But the most meaningful decoration was a simple framed quote that David had given me for my birthday. "The most powerful thing you can do is use your voice to help someone else find theirs." It captured something essential about what my work had become, the way my personal experience had been transformed into a platform for amplifying other voices and creating systemic change. 6 months after the awards ceremony, I received another unexpected call, this time from Mrs. Patterson in Portland. Her voice was gentler than usual, tinged with something that sounded like sadness. "Eunice, dear, I thought you should know. Your mother passed away last week. It was very sudden, a stroke. Jessica asked me to let you know about the funeral in case you wanted to attend." I felt a complex wave of emotions, grief for the relationship we'd never been able to repair, relief that she'd died quickly rather than suffering through a long illness, sadness that we'd never found a way to understand each other. But also, surprisingly, a kind of peace. "Thank you for letting me know," I told Mrs. Patterson. "I won't be attending the funeral, but I appreciate you calling." After hanging up, I sat quietly for a while, thinking about Mom and our complicated relationship. She'd never understood my choices or supported my independence in the way that mattered most. But she'd also never actively tried to sabotage my success. Her failures had been more about absence than malice, more about her own limitations than deliberate harm. I didn't attend the funeral, but I did send flowers with a simple card. "Thinking of your family during this difficult time." It felt like the right balance of acknowledgement without false intimacy, respect without pretending to a closeness that had never existed. A few weeks later, I received a final piece of correspondence from my family. It was a legal document informing me that Mom had left me a small bequest in her will, a sum that wouldn't change my life, but represented her attempt at acknowledging our relationship. There was also a note from Jessica saying that they'd found some of Dad's woodworking tools in Mom's basement, and asking if I wanted them. I kept the money but declined the tools. The financial bequest felt like Mom's way of trying to repair something that couldn't be fixed, but I accepted it as a final gesture of acknowledgement. The tools would have felt too loaded with complicated history, too much like accepting a relationship that had never really existed. Instead, I used the money to establish a scholarship fund for family caregivers who wanted to pursue education in healthcare or social services. It seemed like a fitting way to transform Mom's final gesture into something that would help other people build better lives for themselves. As I sat in my office that evening, working on my next book about workplace policies that support caregivers, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. 5 years earlier, I'd driven away from Portland feeling like a complete failure, someone who'd given everything and received nothing in return. Now, I was a nationally recognized expert whose work was influencing policy at the highest levels of government. I was in a loving relationship with someone who valued my expertise and supported my independence. I was earning more money than I'd ever thought possible, doing work that felt meaningful and important. But the most significant transformation was internal. I'd stopped seeking validation from people who were incapable of providing it. I'd stopped accepting treatment that didn't meet my standards. I'd stopped apologizing for taking up space and started using my voice to create space for others. The family who had given me nothing at that will reading had actually given me everything I needed. They'd given me the motivation to build something entirely my own, the anger to fuel years of hard work, and the independence to create a life that reflected my own values rather than their expectations. I hadn't just survived their rejection. I'd transformed it into the foundation for something bigger and more meaningful than anything I could have inherited. And that transformation belonged entirely to me. David found me in my office later that night, working by lamplight with research papers spread across my desk. "How are you feeling about everything?" he asked, settling into the chair across from my desk. "Grateful," I said, and realized I meant it completely. Grateful for all of it, even the painful parts, especially the painful parts. Because those were the parts that taught me who I really was and what I was capable of becoming. I looked around my office at the evidence of the life I'd built from nothing and felt a deep sense of completion. Not because the story was over, but because I'd finally understood what the story had always been about. It wasn't about getting recognition from people who couldn't see my value. It was about building something so undeniable that even I couldn't doubt my own worth. The girl who'd been erased from family photos had become a woman whose voice was heard in congressional hearings and medical schools. The caregiver who'd been taken for granted was now training the next generation of healthcare providers to better support families in crisis. The daughter who'd been deemed unworthy of inheritance was now leaving a legacy that would outlast any material bequest. They'd given me nothing, and I'd turned that nothing into everything. And tomorrow, I'd wake up and continue building something, even bigger. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.